sheets in there.
Well, yeah, but then I can't scroll to where I want and.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Planning Commission for Monday, May 8th. Let's have a roll call.
Commissioner Becky Schaefer.
Here.
Commissioner Parrish.
Here.
Commissioner Mason.
Here.
Commissioner Lemke.
Here.
Commissioner Jim Schaefer.
Here.
Commissioner Chorin.
Here.
Alderman Worth.
Here.
Mayor Abendroth.
Here. We have a quorum. First item is the approval of the minutes from April 10th.
Move to approve as written.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are approved. Consent agenda includes two items. Number one is Plunkett Racich Architects LLP. The applicant is seeking sign waiver approval for a wall sign on the community pavilion at Homestead High School, 5000 West Mequon Road.
And I have to recuse myself.
And Commissioner Chorin is recusing himself. As you recall, this was before us earlier. And the second one is Lakeside Development Company for Astorwoods condominiums. Does anybody want to take up any of these items?
I believe I have to recuse myself for that one as well, so.
You're going to recuse yourself for the Lakeside condominiums?
Yep. So unless you want to do them separately or.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're good. Anyone want to take up either one of these items? Looking for a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion second to approve the consent agenda. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The consent agenda is approved. You're good to go.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. My name is Devin Cack from Plunkett Racich Architects. As you remember, I was here in November.
You've been approved.
We approved it.
They already approved it. You're good.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Don't talk yourself out of a victory.
Don't say any more.
Yeah. Moving on to regular business, Bonnie Lake Real Estate for Spirit Lake International LLC. The applicant is seeking grading plan approval for a 4-lot land division. Jack,
I have to recuse myself.
okay. There are a lot of recusals here.
The applicant notified us late Friday. He had some concerns with some of the conditions that were in the report from our city engineer. He wanted to make some modifications to the plan, which we said was too late in the game at this point, and so he's agreed to make the modifications and bring it back for our June meeting. We did send the cards out. I know there were some people that in the neighborhood that were probably interested, so we can have a discussion if you have any specific questions, or we can take a motion to table and we'll bring it back in June.
One person registered to speak, Debbie Scott, is in support. But if we're not going to take any action tonight, the best thing to do is just to table this, and let's talk about it when Mr. Bursch is here.
Sure, that's fine.
Motion to table 3A.
Second.
Motion and a second to table. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That item is tabled. Moving on to item 3B, City of Mequon is seeking a text amendment to Chapter 2 of the City of Mequon Code of Ordinances related to the establishment and operation of the Planning Commission.
The Public Welfare Committee is in the process of trying to make all of our boards and commissions consistent with regard to language. The report that you have in front of you, and I did put something on the dais for each one of you regarding that section with regard to membership. As my report says, there's only one substantive change in the ordinance. It wasn't the intent that it was a substantive change, but the Alderman Worth and the committee that was working on it basically interpreted our current language to basically state that we are not in compliance with the way that is framed. So what we did was we put some alternate language on the dais that will allow us to remain in compliant. Basically, you can have 2 districts with more than 1 member if one of the districts is the registered architect. So right now we have 2 members in 2 separate districts. Under the language that's in the packet, that would not be allowed. So that modification will allow us to remain in conformance with the body that we have. All the other changes in there are rather perfunctory and just are really there's no substance to any of them. So we can discuss if you want to make other changes. The committee is asking that at their next meeting we get input from all the different boards and commissions to the proposed changes, and they'd like a recommendation or motion from the commission to approve or modify and approve the language in front of you. So thank you.
Does anybody have any comments? Any questions? Alderman Worth? No?
I don't have any questions. I helped draft the pile of junk that's in front of you, so I think I know what's there.
I would make a comment. I appreciate this because having the architect count as one of two citizen members makes it more difficult as far as appointing people. And also, planning commissioners represent the entire community. They're not appointed to represent any specific geographic area. And requiring, that no more than two reside in any one district, in some sort of a way it does that. It sort of spreads it out, and it occasionally impedes the appointment process when you have a lot of candidates from one district. And I'd prefer, as the person who appoints people, I'd prefer not to have that limitation. Maybe it's a good safeguard so that we don't have a lot of people piling up in any one district. But as the language says, no more than two members may reside in any one aldermanic district, which I think is good. But then it says, goes further and goes, no more than one aldermanic district may have two members, which to me is kind of restrictive. I would strike that personally, but no more than two citizen members may reside in any one aldermanic district. So whatever district it is, you can have two members from that district. Then it says no more than one aldermanic district may have two members. So you can only have one district with two members.
Right.
Now, that's except for the district that the architect, actually both architects.
I think there's only one person appointed as the architect.
Right, right. And Jim is the architect, and Marty's also from District 5, and Marty happens to also be an architect, but that's not the point. If you got rid of the part that says no more than one aldermanic district may have two citizen members, then you could have three districts, each with two members, and those would be your citizen members. I don't know if that's a bad thing.
So you end up with perhaps less representation sometimes in certain
You could
districts, but that doesn't matter because we represent.
You could
all
end
of
up with
Mequon.
less geographic
Got it.
dispersal. This way you get the geographic dispersal.
Is what you're saying essentially there'd be a period after two citizen members and everything else would be struck?
That last clause,
Instead of the comma.
Everything, okay.
no more than one district.
So everything underlined,
No, everything, on the first line with where the comma is, he put a period there and get rid of everything after that. Is what you're
Yeah.
suggesting, right?
Yeah. I'm fine with this the way it is because this reflects what we're doing today. Doesn't really hamstring us, but
Have you found it, has it been difficult to try to adhere to it the way that it is today? As the person who appoints? Has
the
there been enough
impediment comes
interest
when
in
you have good qualified candidates all from the same district.
Yeah, and I guess
We have two candidates here from the 6th district, and let's say we had an outstanding candidate that was from the 6th district, there was a vacancy.
facing goes.
I could not appoint that person because we already have two candidates from the 6th district. I guess I couldn't anyway, could I?
Not,
No, I couldn't anyway.
But you want geographic representation.
I don't think that we benefited from that, really. Maybe it's a good safeguard, though. Commissioner?
Well, a few years ago, I think in 2010, we made a change to this ordinance to allow the original change was, it had originally had been every citizen member had to live in a different district. And at the time, Mayor Nurnberg had said, look, it shouldn't apply to the architect, because we ought to be able to put that person, you know,
On a
there aren't that many
pedestal?
architects, and therefore, you know, it kind of is based on where that person lives, and we ought to make that one exception. At the time, there was some resistance in the council, because the concern always had been, and particularly for those of us who live west of the river, that there are a lot more people who live east of the river, and that it would end up being, and mayors have, I don't know if that's true, that they've been historically living east of the river, but,
I live on the west side.
well, we live right at the river.
He's on the west side.
But, you know, that was the concern, that it would end up being dominated by people from one side of the river or the other, or from the north side or the south side. I mean, we kind of have a
Or
couple.
the mayor's friends.
Yeah,
Something like that.
and to get people spread out so that you have some, you know, people who understand what a Freistatter is, or what a, you know, it means to live in the 8th district, which is a whole different animal. And, you know, that was I don't know when it started, but I do know that there have been a few aldermen who feel very strongly about this. I'm kind of indifferent.
Yeah, I can accept this the way it is. And actually, before that, there was no requirement by districts, and at some point in the 90s, we put that in because we had too many people all from one district,
Southeast Mequon.
and essentially, we kind of wanted to break up that cabal, so we created the language that they had to be from different districts, just to get rid of that. The way this is written is fine with me.
We have 3 ordinances in front of us, don't we?
Well, not really.
For this particular item you're talking about, or overall?
Regarding the bodies, there's one ordinance that rewrites, well, the general provisions which apply to this.
Right.
There's the ordinance that rewrites the planning commission specifically. Then there's the ordinance that deals with the 3 other bodies that fall under
Chapter 58,
Or Chapter 58.
correct.
Those were there, so that's a separate ordinance. And then there's an ordinance, well, that one's more perfunctory, and it just because this is a charter ordinance, it plops something in Chapter 2 also. But that longer ordinance that deals with the other bodies in Chapter 58 and some general changes.
Yeah, I was going to bring that back for a full text
Oh.
amendment once all the different bodies had weighed in.
Okay.
I know the Landmarks has weighed in. I don't think Board of Appeals has weighed in as of yet. So, and then the Architectural Board, I think, was taking that up tonight. So once those 3 bodies weigh in and we get their feedback back to Public Welfare, I'll bring the Chapter 58 actual ordinance change to this body, because we won't get involved in changes to the general provisions or Chapter 2. That'll not be in front of this body, but you're basically giving your feedback to Public Welfare, so when they make their changes. So once I get all the 58 changes and everybody's agreed them, we'll bring them back here for formal adoption of the amendment, and then it'll go on to council for final approval. I did put them in there
Public
just.
welfare.
Public Welfare and, well, it'll also go to Common Council after the body recommends, the Planning Commission recommends it. So I will bring those back. I did put them in there for your reference. Most of it is perfunctory. There isn't many major changes. And again, Landmarks did approve the changes to their body, and we're still waiting on Board of Appeals and Architectural Review Board.
So I move approval with this changed language.
Move approval of the text amendment to Chapter 2 with the revised paragraph C.
Second.
Motion and second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That motion passes. 3C, City of Mequon is seeking a text amendment to Chapter 58 of the zoning code as it relates to residential gardens.
Yes, this is something that Alderman Urban asked us to look into. He had a an issue in his former district, District 7, where there was a garden within the front yard, and he was getting complaints from some of the neighbors. And when he contacted us, we let him know there was not an ordinance against it, so he asked us to look into some language. We went through a couple different revisions of the language, and what we have in front of you is something that we felt was at least restrictive enough to provide some guidance. I will say we do not issue permits for gardens, so we don't really have, this would all be done by enforcement complaint, just like most of other, like I reference in there, like basketball poles. We don't issue permits for basketball poles. Those are all based on complaint. And other types of accessory structures like swing sets, playgrounds, things like that. So what we did here, to try to limit the impact of the garden, we put a couple stipulations on the fact that if it's going to be in the front yard, it has to meet certain requirements. And one of them, that it would have to be closer to the dwelling than the ultimate right-of-way. But in no case could it be closer than 30 feet to the ultimate right-of-way. And we also stated that it would have to be it had to be farther away from the side property lines as the existing house. So we want it basically kind of in that same line as the house. And then we also added a condition that says enclosures constructed of chicken wire, welded wire, woven wire are prohibited. I did work with Alderman Worth over the last several days. He made some tweaks to the ordinance, which you have in front of you. We did remove trees from that definition because, kind of meld into an orchard perhaps, or just if it's a couple standalone trees, we didn't want to regulate that. So I believe in his version, he struck the word trees out. And we also changed the words with regard to intended to sell to a commercial. You cannot sell it commercially. So we felt that was a little bit better language and enforceable if we did find out that they were actually selling to commercial properties or restaurants or things like that. So again, we're open to feedback. This is, again, not a major issue, and it's, again, we don't issue permits for it, so it'll be all complaint-driven. But we felt it was somewhat reasonable. We did not want to see gardens right up to the ultimate right-of-way in the front setback, and obviously Alderman Urban felt the same way. So looking forward to any comments or suggestions moving forward.
Jack, this is only relative to the front setback, right?
Correct. Right now, in the rear, or behind the house, or to the side of the house, or beyond the actual front setback, we do not have any regulations.
What about situations where people are just growing the front yard out, and going for the natural garden look, and is that?
We did address that a number of
separate?
years ago. A number of years ago, if you recall, we passed an ordinance with regard to turf grass. We never had an ordinance that were related to the height of grass. And it became a big issue when the foreclosure crisis hit. So we put a condition in there that you had to have no higher than 8 inches for grass, but we did put language in there that you could have natural vegetation if you provided us with a plan. And we've had a couple of those where people have submitted. You're not just allowed to let your grass go long and say it's natural. So you have to actually submit us a plan with regard to species and things like that.
So that's in a different,
It's in the same section, but it's
Okay.
different than this, yes.
thank you.
Jack, what if somebody planted their whole front yard with flowers, roses, and all different kinds of flowers and sold those? Does this language cover that?
Well, they wouldn't be able to, they could plant, we actually purposely left out flowers as well, because I don't think that's as objectionable as vegetables or other things. Selling them would be problematic unless they could comply with our home occupation requirements, which I don't think they would be able to, unless they actually grew them and then took them somewhere else and sold them. If you try to sell them on site, our home occupation requirements say you cannot generate customer traffic to the site.
Okay.
I guess I just have a question on language. Where are we saying they can do whatever they want in their backyard? Because it defines a residential garden, and it says you can't sell produce from that. But then it says a residential garden can't be in the front yard. So I guess I'm a little fuzzy on if somebody has a big garden in their backyard, can they still sell the produce from that?
Well, technically, again, if you're selling produce, you're not a OA property, an agricultural overlay with 10 acres, you're not allowed to do commercial farming. So by definition, a residential garden means that you cannot sell and make a profit from what you're growing. So that is the definition, and that applies across the board. Now, the restriction for where it's located, basically it says the front, you cannot have a garden within the front yard setback unless you meet the criteria. So if it's outside the front setback, then there's no limitation on where you can put it. And that applies, say, in an example, like a 5-acre lot on R1 zoning, you have a 100-foot setback. If they're 150 feet back and they're outside the setback, then they don't have those restrictions. It's primarily intended to keep it away from the public right-of-way in the front and adjacent to other properties in the front that probably will have a manicured lawn or driveway nearby where they don't want it encroaching up to the property line.
I guess I'm just confused why we need Part A in there about selling commercial produce then. I mean, if you're already keeping it out of the front yard, there's probably backyard people that have 5 acres that have a couple acres that sell at a farmer's market. I don't see a problem with that.
But I think you're saying it's not allowed at all in a residential garden, front, back, side, otherwise.
Well, it depends, I guess, on how you do it. If you grew vegetables in your rear yard and you took them to a farmer's market, I don't think there's an ordinance that would prevent that. If you,
I think this would,
this would,
and
correct.
maybe we shouldn't.
I don't see a problem with it.
I think the intent of what we were trying to accomplish was to try to prevent that front yard from being used solely
Right,
for that purpose.
I fully
So,
agree with
okay.
the front yard. I just don't, I think this adds the backyard in, and I don't think we need to.
Well, then we could add A as a sub to B.
Why do you need A at all?
Right.
I mean, aren't you simply trying to restrict the garden, the location of the vegetable garden, you know, and say, don't put it out by the road? That's the only, right, that's the purpose, I think.
Yeah, and it's going to be awfully difficult to prove that somebody's actually violating Section A.
That's why I took it out of your definition, because if you had it in the definition, I don't think you could ever cite anybody. But I agree with Mr. Lemke that maybe it doesn't make sense to have it all. You've already got home occupation restrictions that would keep somebody from having a farmer's market in their front yard.
Yeah.
Was it in there, was this so this is all new language, right?
Correct.
Was there any previous complaints that, like, related to this? Is that why the?
That
audit
the
came in?
complaint in District 7, it wasn't proven, but I think from what Alderman Urban was saying, that the product he was growing, he was selling to restaurants.
Okay.
And so his original language that he proposed to us had that language in there. Now, I don't know if we ever proved that it was actually happening, but I think that's what he was hearing from some of the neighbors.
And the problem with that was because it was in the front yard, correct?
Right, yeah, he was basically trying to maximize his front yard and grow as much as he possibly could.
It
So-
goes right to the road and has all sorts of wire and I drove by it.
Optics are good.
So if we are controlling the intensity of it, then maybe we do not even need to address Section A on that.
Are we making a judgment between what a garden looks like versus what a lawn looks like? This is visual
Yes, I mean,
interpretation here, vegetables versus grass.
well, I think it's not necessarily well, I think there's two parts. One is typically the enclosure is where, and I think that's what the issue with the complaint was, the enclosures was, again, chicken wire, other kind of metal, which you're not going to typically put around your grass. And the other issue, having it that close to the road, there may be a concern in the non-growing season of erosion issues, sediment going into the culvert as well, so, or into the ditch and into the culvert. So I think it's a twofold issue. Again, I don't think we want to get into being the garden police, but I think we'd have discretion to make a call whether they would be in violation of this or not on a case-by-case basis.
Seems unnecessary.
I was thinking about what you were just saying, and you could throw in a square footage. You could work on the definition of a garden by doing things like square footage, but walking that back, you almost want the flexibility to, as far as administering it, to say this is a garden or this versus this is a lawn. So
Yeah, the alderman actually tried to put language in with regard to square footage and part of a floor aeration.
it's good to be
It'd be difficult because they would have to submit a survey with the drawing to show how big it is, and that it really becomes cumbersome for the applicant and for us to enforce as well.
They're growing food.
Yeah. complaint was more the optics of it, right? It was not
Yes.
aesthetically pleasing. It's hard for me to want to regulate too much what someone is doing in their own home when it really is something that's like a movement, local food. I mean, I wouldn't want to discourage it. I wouldn't necessarily want my neighbor to have a chicken wire fence right up to the road either. So I think if we
And that's why we added, I mean, you know, we talked at one point about just prohibiting it in the front setback, and we didn't want to do that, and that's why we put this language together to allow some flexibility to the, you know, to have it in the front, but not just allow them to have it carte blanche.
Mayor Abernathy, you're saying you don't, what are you saying? You don't like it enough?
Yeah, it seems unnecessary.
Big
Can you plant a garden in the ultimate road right-of-way?
Can you right now?
Yes.
If it's, when ultimate road right-of-way gets a little tricky, because that could be, part of that could be publicly owned, and part of it could be privately owned at this point. So the publicly owned portion, I would say no. The privately owned, I would say yes. Because some properties right now go to the center line, and that's why we're using ultimate road right-of-way.
And tomatoes out to the center line.
I think it's reasonable to say you can't make your whole front yard a garden, so I think that makes sense as long as you can do what you want in the backyard. I think as it's written, it fixes some of the problems that obviously have come up.
You know, one of the differences between this and the natural landscaping movement is, I have a nice vegetable garden, but, you know, you end up with tomato cages and stakes and, you know, and you, trellises for your, yeah, well, that too, but trellises for your cucumbers or whatever the hell, you know, they're not necessarily aesthetically pleasing,
Right.
you know, vegetable gardens, and having it out at the road, particularly, and I kind of wonder why this isn't in this guy's backyard, and I think he does have a backyard.
I think he's got other shrubs and bushes he's growing back there. I'm not sure what he's doing with those as well, so. There was numerous complaints on this property. It wasn't specific to just this issue.
Is he still there?
I believe he is,
Is that a rental?
yes.
Jack, a question. If I have 10 rows with 8 trees each of apple trees in my front yard, is that,
Well, now that we struck the tree language out of here, then you'd be okay.
but again, do we want that? Do we want some guy turning his front yard into an apple orchard?
I did run into one in I believe it was in Whitefish Bay over the weekend where somebody kind of did that. It did look a little unusual, but I guess I'm not sure the odds or probability of somebody doing that. Because it's going to be hard to differentiate between someone doing that versus someone having 8 or 10 scattered apple trees in the front and trying to determine what's, is it a garden versus just trees. So,
Right.
so I think, I agree maybe with striking that avoids that situation, and it may never come up as a potential violation. And if it does, we can go back and look at the language again, so.
Okay.
So if this passes, you're going to go out and tell this homeowner to move their garden? Or tell the landlord to tell his tenant to move the garden?
Yes. If it-
What's your
I have
pleasure?
mixed feelings.
Huh?
I have mixed feelings like you do. I
Yeah,
don't like making new rules. Like all this,
And this is for one house. And it's food. Anybody want to adopt this?
I get the point, but
Well, how do we address the one homeowner without something like this?
There's nothing in the ordinance he's violating, so he would not, he would be able to continue what he's doing, basically.
how neighbor relations, can they talk it out?
Well, I haven't heard to see what Alderman Nurbin has actually moved. Now he's in representing District 8, so he hasn't been involved, and we have a vacancy in District 7, so I'm not sure where things are at
but he
with.
did call me today and said this is still, he believes still a problem, and
Gardening
is
season.
hoping it gets passed. But I'll move approval partially to have it go to council so that we have a public hearing and it has some opportunity for further debate. So I'd move approval to approve it without paragraph A.
I'll second that.
With the A.
Motion and a second to approve 58-8, 58-420, paragraph 7, without A. And there's a second. Any further
Just
discussion?
want to make sure that it gets reflected to council that the planning commission had a lot of, mixed feelings about it and the concern about big government versus wanting to make sure the neighbors aren't grossly offended by someone's chicken wire.
But you can have chickens.
So, Jack, there's nothing like a general nuisance ordinance that you could address?
We do have like general outdoor maintenance.
Yeah.
But it'd be, and in fact, when I was doing some research just to see what other communities across the state or country were doing with regard to this, I did find several communities that did push ordinance violations with certain residents, but they were all using basically like an erosion ordinance. No one that I found had a specific ordinance that stated residential garden shall be prohibited. They were using the lack of ground cover during the non-growing season as their, and it was in their general maintenance. But a lot of those, from what I could tell, were thrown out or were difficult to enforce and defend, so.
Don't we already have a nuisance clause somewhere, though?
Well, we do have a nuisance requirements, but this would have to be fairly severe to rise to a level of a nuisance. There's certain criteria and there's a process that's in place, and I think that's a lot more cumbersome of a process than just having this in place and enforcing it.
Yeah, it has to affect the public health and welfare,
To be a nuisance.
not just your visual sensibilities. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 I'm opposed. 7-1, pass here. Announcements, the next meeting is June 12th.
Move to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn,
So moved.
second. Motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned.